On the night Baltimore won Super Bowl 47, Ray Rice didn't just celebrate in the locker room. He walked back out onto the field, alone, sat down on the 50-yard line, and stared up at the empty seats for a long time. A janitor who was cleaning the stands later told a local reporter he watched the whole thing and didn't want to interrupt. He looked like a man who had everything, the janitor said, and knew it. 18 months later, that same man stood in a casino hallway in Atlantic City, dragging an unconscious woman out of an elevator by one arm, and glanced both ways down the corridor like he was checking if anyone had seen him park in a fire lane. The woman was his fiancée. The elevator had a camera, and 49 seconds of footage were about to do what no linebacker in the NFL ever could, end Ray Rice completely. Ray Rice grew up in New Rochelle, New York, in a neighborhood where several of his childhood friends didn't make it out. Not because they lacked talent, because the street had a way of deciding for you before you could decide for yourself. Ray's father was shot and killed when Ray was just 1 year old. His mother, Janet, worked double shifts to keep them stable. There was no room for mistakes. Football wasn't a dream for Ray Rice. It was a wall he built between himself and everything else. By the time he got to Rutgers, coaches didn't just notice his speed or his vision. They noticed something harder to quantify, a need to be needed. Former Rutgers offensive coordinator Brian Bendel once said in a local interview that Rice was the only player he'd ever coached who would voluntarily stay after practice not to work on his game, but to make sure the freshman linemen had rides home. He took care of people, Bendel said. That was just who he was. The Baltimore Ravens selected him 55th overall in the 2008 draft. He was not the flashiest pick. He was not the highest-rated back. But John Harbaugh later said Rice was the first player he knew, before a single snap, he could trust completely. Not because of his talent, because of his character. What nobody examined closely enough was this. Ray Rice had built his entire identity around being the dependable one. The protector. The man who showed up. He had been that person since he was 6 years old, standing in a doorway in New Rochelle, watching his mother leave for a night shift. That need to hold everything together, for everyone, was his greatest strength. It was also the thing that made it impossible for him to ask for help when he needed it most. When the final whistle blew in New Orleans, Ray Rice dropped to his knees on the field and covered his face with both hands. Not a celebration, something closer to relief. Like a man who had been holding his breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. His teammates mobbed him. His fiancée Janae ran onto the field. For one night, everything he had worked for since New Rochelle was standing right there in front of him. Real, earned, and impossible to take away. 3 months later, the Ravens gave him a 5-year contract worth $35 million. At that moment, Ray Rice was the highest-paid running back in the entire NFL. Local kids in Baltimore wore his jersey to school. His face was on billboards on I-95. He had become exactly what the city needed him to be. But inside the facility, something had quietly shifted. Offensive coordinator Cam Cameron, one of Rice's biggest internal advocates, was fired mid-season 2012. Unusual timing that rattled the entire offensive rhythm. The system Rice had mastered, built around his patience and his ability to catch out of the backfield, began to change underneath him. New schemes, new personnel groupings. Rice adapted publicly, smiled at press conferences, said the right things. But teammates noticed he was spending less time in the film room after hours, less time staying late to work with the younger running backs the way he once had. A former Ravens special teams player, speaking years later on a podcast, recalled a specific moment from training camp in the summer of 2013. Rice showed up to a voluntary workout, looked around the room at the younger backs, the ones who were faster, hungrier, cheaper, and said nothing. Just sat down, laced up his cleats, and got to work. But his eyes were different, the player said. Like he already knew something the rest of us didn't want to admit yet. On the field in 2013, the production numbers were still respectable. Over 1,100 yards from scrimmage. Reliable, professional. But the explosiveness that had defined his first 5 NFL seasons had quietly flattened. The league had studied him. Defensive coordinators were loading the box before the snap. And Rice, at 26, was discovering for the first time in his life that being dependable was not the same as being irreplaceable. Off the field, he and Janae had moved into a large house in the Baltimore suburbs. By all appearances, perfect. 2 people who had known each other since high school, now living the exact life they had sketched out together as teenagers. Engagement ring, NFL money, a future that seemed engineered to last. But people who knew them closely described something harder to name, a relationship that had been under low, sustained pressure for years. Two identities so completely fused that neither one had ever been allowed to exist fully on their own terms. Ray was the protector. Janae was the foundation. The roles were never spoken out loud. They didn't need to be. Nobody read it as a warning sign. It looked too much like love. February 15, 2014, Atlantic City, New Jersey, the Revel Casino. Ray Rice and Janae Palmer had been together for nearly a decade. They had survived the draft, the Super Bowl, the contract, the spotlight. That night, they were simply two people at a casino, away from Baltimore, away from the schedule, away from everything that defined them publicly. Nobody knows exactly what the argument was about. What the security footage shows is this: two people entering an elevator already in conflict. Raised voices. Then, inside the elevator, a single punch. Janae dropped. Her head struck the metal railing on the way down. She was unconscious before she hit the floor. When the doors opened, Ray Rice stepped out first. He looked left, he looked right, then he reached back in and pulled her out by one arm, her body limp against the casino carpet. A hotel employee appeared within seconds. Rice's explanation, according to reports, was calm, almost casual. She was his fiancée. They had too much to drink. Everything was fine. Within hours, both Ray Rice and Janae Palmer were arrested on simple assault charges. By the following morning, it was a back-page item: athlete altercation, mutual charges, no major injuries reported. The kind of story that in 2014, NFL franchises had learned to absorb quietly and move on from quickly. The Baltimore Ravens released a statement expressing support for Rice and his family. Commissioner Roger Goodell was briefed. The NFL opened an investigation. And then, almost nothing happened. For 4 months, the league sat on the case. Rice entered a pretrial intervention program in May 2014, which allowed him to avoid a criminal conviction entirely if he completed counseling. New Jersey prosecutors agreed. The NFL, conducting its own parallel process, interviewed Rice and Janae together, a decision later criticized by domestic violence experts as a fundamental error, one that almost never produces honest testimony from a victim when her abuser is in the room. On July 24, 2014, Roger Goodell announced his ruling. Ray Rice would be suspended for 2 games without pay. 2 games. To put that number in context, that same offseason, Cleveland Browns wide receiver Josh Gordon was facing a full season suspension, 16 games, for testing positive for marijuana. The implicit message broadcast to every player, every fan, and every domestic violence advocate paying attention was not subtle. In the NFL's hierarchy of sins, getting high ranked higher than putting your fiancé unconscious on a casino floor. The backlash was swift and sharp. Women's advocacy groups called for Goodell's resignation. Sponsors began asking quiet questions. Several prominent female sports journalists published open letters. Goodell, sensing the ground shifting, called a press conference in late August and did something NFL commissioners almost never do. He admitted he had gotten it wrong. Effective immediately, the league announced a new baseline policy: 6 games for a first domestic violence offense, a potential lifetime ban for a second. It looked like accountability. It would not last long enough to matter for Ray Rice, because on the morning of September 8, 2014, TMZ published the video from inside the elevator, the footage that had existed for 7 months. The footage that an Associated Press source would later claim had been received by the NFL league office, confirmed by a voicemail left by someone at that office acknowledging its arrival. The footage that Roger Goodell would maintain under oath and in public statements he had never seen before that morning. 49 seconds. That is how long it took for everything to collapse. Within 3 hours of the video's publication, the Baltimore Ravens terminated Ray Rice's contract, the 5-year, $35 million deal that had made him the face of the franchise. The announcement came via press release. No phone call from Harbaugh first. No meeting. A press release like a utility shutoff notice. 2 hours after that, the NFL suspended Rice indefinitely. By evening, number 27 Ravens jerseys were being cut up and thrown in trash cans outside M&T Bank Stadium. Fans who had defended Rice for months, who had argued the 2-game suspension was sufficient, who had called the backlash overblown, were posting public apologies on social media. The difference between hearing about violence and watching it, it turned out, was everything. But the story did not stop with Rice. In the days that followed, reporters began pulling on a thread that the NFL desperately did not want pulled. If the video had been available since February, sent to league offices, confirmed received, then what exactly had the investigation consisted of? What had the interview with Rice and Janae actually produced? And who had decided, with full knowledge of what that elevator contained, that 2 games was the appropriate response? Goodell maintained his position. The NFL had requested the video from law enforcement and been denied. The video TMZ obtained, he said, was a surprise to everyone in the league office. Law enforcement sources told a different story. The AP reported that a law enforcement official had mailed a DVD copy of the in-elevator footage to an NFL executive, and that a female voice on a voicemail at the league office confirmed its receipt with the words, "You're right, it's terrible." The NFL hired former FBI Director Robert Mueller to conduct an independent investigation. Mueller's report, released in January 2015, concluded there was no evidence that any NFL executive had seen the in-elevator video prior to its public release, but also found that the league's investigation had been, in his words, inadequate. Investigators had not requested the video directly from the casino. They had not pressed law enforcement hard enough. They had accepted the Rice's account without sufficient scrutiny. In other words, the NFL had not necessarily lied. It had simply chosen at every decision point not to look too hard. That distinction between active deception and willful blindness would define the Ray Rice scandal long after the headlines faded. It was not a story about one man's violence alone. It was a story about what a $15 billion industry decides it needs to know, and what it decides is safer left unseen. The elevator had a camera. The league had every reason to watch the footage, and for 7 months, somehow, nobody did. The day after the Ravens cut him, Ray Rice did not leave town. He stayed in Baltimore, stayed in the house in the suburbs, stayed with Janae, who, to the bewilderment of millions of people watching from the outside, did not leave either. On September 9, 2014, the morning after the indefinite suspension, Janae Palmer posted a statement on Instagram. It was not what the public expected. There was no condemnation of her husband, no relief that the secret was finally out. Instead, she wrote about loss, her loss. The loss of privacy, the loss of the life they had been quietly rebuilding since February, the loss of something she described as being ripped away not by Ray, but by the relentless media coverage itself. No one knows the pain that the media and unwanted opinions from the public has caused my family, she wrote. To make us relive a moment in our lives that we regret every day is a horrible thing. The public reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Many people dismissed her words as the script of a woman too afraid or too conditioned to speak freely. Domestic violence counselors noted carefully that this response, protecting the relationship, redirecting blame outward, is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most documented patterns in intimate partner violence cases. That did not make it any easier to watch. What it did do was complicate the clean narrative everyone wanted. Ray Rice was not a stranger who attacked a woman in an elevator. He was her partner of 10 years, the father figure. Her family had accepted the man she had chosen to marry. 4 months after the incident, their wedding had taken place in late March 2014. While the NFL investigation was still ongoing, the relationship did not end because a video went public. The video went public and the relationship continued. For Ray Rice professionally, the silence was total. In the weeks following the suspension, not a single NFL team called. This was not because the league had formally banned him. Legally, a federal judge in November 2014 actually overturned the indefinite suspension, ruling that Goodell had violated the collective bargaining agreement by punishing Rice twice for the same offense. Rice was technically free to play. The phone still did not ring. One agent, speaking anonymously to a sports publication in early 2015, described the situation plainly. Every team knows the math. You sign Ray Rice and every game becomes a press conference about Ray Rice. No offensive coordinator wants that. No owner wants that. He was 27 years old, in the prime of a running back's career, and the NFL had decided, without a formal ruling, that the cost of his presence outweighed the value of his talent. Rice spent months training alone. Former teammates occasionally reached out privately. Texts, brief calls. Publicly, almost no one in the league spoke on his behalf. The locker room, which had once been the place where he felt most like himself, was now closed to him without announcement, without appeal, and without any real explanation. In interviews years later, Rice described that entire period with a single image: waking up at 5 a.m. out of habit, putting on his training gear, lacing up his cleats, and sitting at the kitchen table for a long time before remembering there was nowhere to go. That image, a man fully dressed for a game that no longer existed, is the one that stays. Ray Rice never played another NFL game, but the league he left behind was not the same one he had entered. In December 2014, all 32 NFL owners voted unanimously to adopt a comprehensive new personal conduct policy, the most significant overhaul of its kind in the league's entire history. The new framework established explicit minimum suspensions, 6 games without pay for a first domestic violence offense, with the very real possibility of a lifetime ban for a second. It created an independent investigation process, deliberately removing the franchise, the entity with the most direct financial incentive to protect its own player, from the center of any conduct review. And it expanded mandatory education and counseling programs across all players, coaches, and team personnel league-wide. Before Ray Rice, the average NFL suspension for a domestic violence incident was roughly 1.5 games. The difference between that number and 6 is not a policy adjustment. It is a formal admission that the previous standard was never a real policy at all. Roger Goodell survived the scandal. He kept his job, kept his salary, reported at over $40 million annually, and kept his authority over player discipline. His handling of the Rice case became a permanent fixture in the ongoing argument about whether the NFL's power structure is genuinely capable of holding itself accountable, or whether accountability only arrives when a camera makes looking away impossible. The person whose story received the least airtime throughout all of it was Janay Rice. In the years that followed, she gave several long-form interviews, to ESPN, to various print outlets, in which she spoke not as a symbol or a cautionary tale, but as a person trying to explain a relationship that the public had decided it already fully understood. She described the night in Atlantic City as one moment inside a decade of something far more complicated. She described the media coverage as a second violation, one that took something deeply private and turned it into content. She asked more than once why her voice had been the quietest one in a story that was entirely about her. That question does not have a comfortable answer. What Ray Rice's case ultimately changed was not just the rule book, it changed the conversation. Awkwardly, imperfectly, incompletely, about what professional sports leagues owe the people in their orbit who are not on the payroll, about what it truly means to investigate rather than simply manage, about the real difference between protecting a brand and protecting a human being. The NFL updated its policy. The elevator had already taught everyone the lesson it had to offer. There's a version of this story where Ray Rice is the only subject, the man who threw the punch, the man who lost everything. The face of a policy change he never asked to represent, but the elevator had 2 people in it. Janay Rice rebuilt quietly. Ray Rice spent years learning to exist without the only identity he had known since New Rochelle. The NFL assigned a number to his actions. 2 games, then 6, then a policy. What no rulebook calculates is the cost paid by the person the camera found on the floor. If the league had watched that footage in February, really watched, would any of this have ended differently? Or does a $15 billion machine only change direction when the entire country is already watching? There are more stories like this one. The difference is most of them never had a camera.